On the afternoon of July 8, 1947, a 25-year-old lieutenant sat down at a typewriter on an Army airfield in the New Mexico desert and wrote one paragraph that would outlive him by 58 years. He did not write it because he wanted to. He wrote it because a colonel told him to. And the paragraph said, in plain government English, that the United States Army had recovered a flying disc. Within 3 hours, that sentence was on the wire. Within a day, it was on front pages on 4 continents. And within about the same day, it was gone, retracted, buried, replaced by a photograph of a man kneeling next to a torn weather balloon. The lieutenant spent the rest of his life being the guy who put out the press release the Army took back. The guy who got it wrong. For decades, that was his whole story. Except it wasn't, because that same lieutenant wrote something else near the end. A sworn statement, notarized, sealed, with one instruction attached to it: do not open this until I am dead. He died in December of 2005. And then they opened it. Let's start with what we know. The lieutenant's name was Walter Haut. That's H-A-U-T. He was born in Chicago in 1922. And by the time he reached Roswell, he was not some starstruck kid. He had flown 35 bombing missions against Japan as a bombardier. He had been at Operation Crossroads at Bikini Atoll in 1946, dropping the instrument packages that measured the atomic blasts. This is a man who was in the room more than once for the most classified work the American military was doing on Earth. He knew what a secret felt like. He knew how to carry one. In 1947, he was the public information officer for the 509th Bomb Group at Roswell Army Airfield. The 509th, at that time, was the only unit on the planet authorized to deliver a nuclear weapon. This was not a backwater. This was the sharpest tip of the American spear, sitting in the desert outside a town of about 25,000 people. And on the morning of July 8th, his base commander, Colonel William Blanchard, called him in and dictated a press release. Haut typed it up and hand-delivered it to the town's 2 radio stations and 2 newspapers. The Roswell Daily Record ran it the next day under a headline that Americans have now been reading for 79 years. RAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. That headline is real. You can pull the front page yourself. And then, that same day, it all came apart. General Roger Ramey, Blanchard's superior, up in Fort Worth, went in front of the press and said, no, it's a weather balloon. Here's the debris. Here's Major Jesse Marcel kneeling next to it for the camera. Nothing to see. Everyone go home. And for the most part, everyone went home. For 30 years, here's the strangest part. Walter Haut should have been furious. He was the one left holding the false story. His name was on it. If the flying disc was a mistake, he was the public face of the mistake. And yet, quietly, for the rest of his life, he kept saying a version of the same thing to anyone who asked carefully enough. He'd say, Colonel Blanchard was not a careless man. Blanchard saw that material before he told me to write that release. And there is no chance that a man like that looked at a weather balloon and called it a flying disc. That's a real quote in substance. He said it in a signed statement in 1993, on the record, while he was alive. There is no chance he would have mistaken it for a weather balloon. Now, that is a strange thing to keep insisting on for 40 years. Because think about what it costs him. Every time he says it, he's reopening his own public humiliation. He's the boy who cried disc. There's no upside. He's not selling a book in 1993. He's an old man running a small UFO museum in a small desert town, telling people, patiently, that his commanding officer was not a fool. I want to be careful here. A man defending his own reputation is the most ordinary thing in the world. That proves nothing. I know that. But keep the shape of it in your mind, because it's about to change. I first went looking into this, the way most people do, expecting the debunk. And the debunk is real, and I'm going to give it to you fairly, because if I don't, you shouldn't trust the rest. In 1994, and again in 1997, the United States Air Force released two official reports. The first said the wreckage came from Project Mogul, a top-secret program using high-altitude balloon trains to listen for Soviet nuclear tests. That's why it was classified. That's why nobody could talk about it. Not aliens, espionage. The second report addressed the bodies, and its explanation was, I'll be honest, almost insulting in how mundane it was. The bodies, people remembered, were crash test dummies. Anthropomorphic dummies the Air Force dropped from balloons in the 1950s to test parachutes. That's the official answer. And here is where a fair person has to stop and admit. The Mogul explanation is genuinely good. It accounts for the secrecy. It accounts for the strange foil-like material. It accounts for why the Army lied. Because they were protecting a real, legitimate Cold War program that had nothing to do with anything from the sky. It accounts for almost everything, except the dates. The crash test dummy program didn't begin until 1953. The witnesses were describing bodies in 1947. The Air Force's own answer asked the American public to remember an event 6 years before it could have happened, and file it under the wrong decade. When your official explanation requires the witnesses to be off by half a decade, you don't have an explanation. You have a hope. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's arithmetic. And it's exactly the kind of gap Walter Haut sat and looked at for the rest of his life. Now I need to introduce the second document, the one he told them not to open. In December of 2002, 3 years before he died, Walter Haut signed a sworn, notarized affidavit at his museum in Roswell. Two researchers, Tom Carey and Don Schmidt, held it. His family held a copy. And everyone agreed. This stays sealed until Walter is gone. It was published in 2007 in their book, Witness to Roswell. You can read the full text online right now, and it does not sound like the modest old man who spent 40 years downplaying his role. In the affidavit, Haut says he attended a staff meeting on the morning of July 8th. He names the men in the room: Blanchard, Marcel, and General Roger Ramey and his chief of staff, Colonel Thomas Dubose, both of whom really were in Fort Worth managing this. Haut says samples of the wreckage were passed around that table hand to hand. And he wrote a sentence I keep coming back to. He said it was unlike any material he had, or has, ever seen in his life. Foil thin, paper thin. Yet nobody at that table could tear it, mark it, or identify it. Passed from man to man, each voicing their opinion. No one was able to identify it. And then the affidavit does the thing the living Walter Haut never did. It says that later that day, Colonel Blanchard personally drove him to Building 84, a hangar on the base, and showed him the object. Haut describes it egg-shaped, metallic, roughly 12 to 15 feet long. No windows, no wings, no landing gear. And on the floor, partially under a tarp, two bodies, about 4 feet tall, with heads too large for their bodies. He ends the statement with one line: I am convinced that what I personally observed was some type of craft and its crew from outer space. Signed, notarized, sealed for his own death. Now here is the honest problem, and I won't hide it from you because the skeptics raise it and they're not wrong to. Haut was 80 years old when he signed that. It was decades after the fact. It was facilitated by two researchers whose life's work depends on Roswell being real. And it contradicts 50 years of Haut himself saying he was mostly out of the loop. Critics say the old man was led, that the affidavit is a composite of what he'd absorbed over decades of being the town's UFO celebrity. That's a serious objection, and you should hold on to it. But hold on to this too. If Walter Haut wanted fame, he had 50 years and a live microphone to grab it. Reporters came to him constantly. He could have said, I saw the bodies, on camera in 1980, in 1990, at any anniversary he liked, and become the most famous witness in the world overnight. He didn't. He downplayed it over and over while alive. He put the biggest claim of his life into a box he could only open by dying. That's not the behavior of a man chasing a spotlight. That's the behavior of a man who made a promise. And according to Carey and Schmidt, that's exactly what it was. Haut told them he had sworn to Colonel Blanchard, his friend, his commander, that he would not tell while Blanchard was alive. And Blanchard, it seems, extracted a longer promise than that. Which brings me to the thread that isn't in any book. The one I had to go looking for. And this is where I have to be clear with you. From here, one piece of what I'll describe, I could not fully verify through the official record, and I'll flag it plainly when I reach it. Everyone always follows the officers. Blanchard, Marcel, Ramey. The names that made the reports. But a press release doesn't type itself, and a hangar doesn't guard itself, and bodies don't move themselves onto an aircraft. Roswell, in July of 1947, was full of 19 and 20-year-old enlisted men, the corporals and privates who actually carried the boxes. History wrote down the colonels. It did not write down the kids. I started looking for the kids. And in a self-published 1996 monograph, the kind of thing that exists as a photocopy of a photocopy, passed between researchers, I found a reference to a corporal in the 509th, an air policeman, who, according to a relative, had been assigned to guard duty at Building 84 the week of the crash. The monograph calls him Earl Hensley. I want to be honest. I could confirm a Hensley was in the 509th's rough personnel footprint in that period, but I could not independently verify this specific man was on that specific detail. So take him as what he is. One unverified thread next to a mountain of verified fact. But the detail attributed to him is the reason I couldn't let it go. According to the account, Hensley almost never spoke about the war, the base, any of it. But once, near the end of his life, at a kitchen table in Texas, a granddaughter asked him, the way kids do, whether he'd ever seen anything strange in the army. And the old man, the account says, went quiet for a long time. And then he said one thing. He said, the hangar was cold, not cool. Cold, refrigerator cold, in the New Mexico desert in July when it was 100 degrees on the tarmac 40 feet away. He said they'd been told the cold was for preservation and told not to ask of what. And then he said the sentence that the whole monograph is built around. He said, they didn't tell us to keep people out. They told us to keep the quiet in. Keep the quiet in. I have termed that phrase over more times than I can count. Keep the quiet in. What does it mean to guard a silence instead of a door? A door faces outward. You keep people from coming in. But to keep something quiet in, that's the language of containing what's already inside. That's the posture of a man standing between the world and a thing the world isn't allowed to hear about. Not a guard, a seal. I don't know if Earl Hensley ever said those words. I want to say that as plainly as I can. But I'll tell you what unsettles me. It matches Haut. Haut, in his sealed affidavit, describes a temporary morgue set up on that base to accommodate recovered bodies. A morgue on an active bomber base in July heat. You don't build a morgue for a weather balloon. You don't refrigerate a radar kite. The verified document and the unverified kitchen table story point at the same impossible object, a cold room in the desert with something in it that had to be kept. That's not the detail someone invents to sound convincing. A liar inventing aliens invents the aliens. He doesn't invent the thermostat. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you start looking for the cold rooms, you start finding the empty drawers. Because here is the real signature of this whole case. It isn't the testimony, it's the absence. The record is thinnest, exactly where it should be thickest. The 509th was a meticulous unit. They logged everything because they had to. They handled nuclear weapons. And yet the flight logs, the hangar assignments, the base's own paperwork from that specific week are famously, frustratingly incomplete. Documents that should exist for the most documented kind of unit in the entire military don't. The FBI's own file on the incident, later released, contains a teletype from that July describing the object, with a full line blacked out, redacted, on a case the government now insists was a weather balloon. Ask yourself the question I can't stop asking. What part of a weather balloon requires redaction 79 years later? I don't think that's a coordinated conspiracy with 1,000 people keeping a perfect secret. Frankly, that's harder to believe than the aliens. What I think is quieter, and, in a way, worse. I think a bureaucracy that could not explain what it had did the thing bureaucracies always do, with what they can't explain. It didn't file it. It didn't log it. It chose, at every fork, the path of least documentation. Don't write down what you can't classify. Don't classify what you can't name. And the not writing, repeated 100 times by 100 frightened people who just wanted to keep their jobs, produces the exact same fingerprint as a cover-up. A hole shaped precisely like the truth. Marcel described it himself in Haut's affidavit and in his own decades of interviews. He took the real debris to Ramey's office in Fort Worth. He stepped into a map room, and when he came back, the story goes, the real material had been swapped for the shredded remains of a weather balloon, laid out for the cameras. Marcel was upset. And then, in Haut's words, we would not discuss it again. We would not discuss it again. That's the sound this whole case makes. Every thread, followed far enough, ends in a man deciding not to discuss it again. Blanchard until he died. Haut until he died. Marcel, mostly. A corporal at a kitchen table, once, for one sentence, and then never again. And that's what makes the affidavit so heavy. Because a sealed statement, opened only after death, is the exact opposite of not discussing it. It's a man who kept his promise to the living and broke it to the dead. He waited until Blanchard was gone. He waited until he himself was gone. He arranged his one true sentence to arrive in a world he'd already left, where no one could pull him into a studio and make him take it back, the way they made the Army take back that first press release in 1947. He learned, maybe, from his own paragraph, he'd written one true sentence, once, in the daylight, with his name on it, and watched the world erase it before sundown. So the second time, he wrote it in the dark, and locked the door, and put the key in his own grave. So what actually remains when the noise dies down? A front page from the Roswell Daily Record. Real, printed, dated July 9th, 1947. A retraction printed within a day. 2 sworn affidavits from the same man, 9 years apart, both saying his commander could not have mistaken what he saw. A sealed statement, opened at his death, describing an egg-shaped craft and 2 small bodies with heads too large in a hangar called Building 84. An official government explanation that asks you to misremember the decade. A redacted FBI teletype about a balloon, and somewhere out past the edge of the verifiable record, a photocopy of a photocopy, and an old man's sentence about a cold room and keeping the quiet in. I can't tell you that a spacecraft crashed in the New Mexico desert in the summer of 1947. I want to be clear about that. I did not see it. No one living saw it who wasn't 80 years old and telling it secondhand. The evidence does not close. But I've spent a long time now with liars and with secret keepers, and I've come to believe they leave different marks. A lie is smooth. A lie is built to be told, so it's shaped to go down easy. Clean edges, no loose ends, a weather balloon, and a photo op, and everybody home by supper. A secret is jagged. A secret leaks at the seams. It shows up as a redaction that protects nothing. A morgue nobody can explain. A personnel record that's thorough about everything except the 1 week that matters. A friendship sealed by a promise not to speak, and a confession timed to arrive from beyond the grave. Roswell does not have the shape of a lie. It has the shape of a secret. And so the questions don't close either. What was in Building 84 cold enough to need refrigerating in July. Why does the most documented unit in the American military have a hole in its records exactly 1 week wide? Why did Colonel Blanchard, on his own authority, tell a 25-year-old to announce a flying disc and then spend a career making his friends swear never to explain it? What was on the line the FBI blacked out? If it was only ever a balloon, who is still being protected? And from what? What did Walter Haut see in that hangar that was worth waiting 58 years and his own death to finally say out loud? And if a young corporal really did stand in a cold room in the desert with orders to keep the quiet in, how many other men stood in rooms like that all over this country in the years after, and how many of them are running out of time to open their own sealed envelopes right now, tonight, while we're talking? Walter Haut wrote the first sentence of the Roswell story in the daylight, and the world took it back by dark. So he wrote the last one where they couldn't reach it, he signed it, he sealed it, he died, and then it spoke.